October 8th, 1918, 6:10 hours. Argonne Forest, France. Corporal Alvin York crouched in the mud at the edge of a clearing in the Argonne Forest, watching German soldiers emerge from their dugouts with their hands up. His patrol, 17 men from Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, had just captured a German command post, along with about 25 prisoners. It should have been a clean operation. Get the prisoners back to American lines, silence the machine gun nests, move on. But war is never clean. From the ridge above, German machine guns opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. A dozen MG-08 machine guns firing simultaneously, each spewing 600 rounds per minute. The air filled with bullets, a steel curtain cutting through the morning mist. In seconds, 6 Americans were killed. 3 more were wounded. The German prisoners hit the ground, terrified of being killed by their own side. Corporal York found himself in command of what remained. 7 unwounded Americans and 25 German prisoners, pinned down in a small depression, taking fire from multiple directions. Above them on the ridge, at least 30 German soldiers manned machine gun positions that commanded the entire area. Any movement meant death. Alvin York had a choice. He could order his men to retreat, abandon the prisoners, and try to make it back to American lines. Or he could do something insane. He chose insane. For the next hour, Alvin York, a 30-year-old former conscientious objector from the mountains of Tennessee, who had initially refused to fight because killing violated his Christian faith, would pick off German soldiers one by one with his rifle, using skills learned hunting turkeys in the Appalachian Mountains. By the time he was done, he would kill at least 28 Germans, force to surrender a German major and 90 more soldiers, and march back to American lines with 132 prisoners. 1 man, 1 rifle, 1 hour, 132 prisoners. When his commanders asked how he had done it, York's answer was simple: I had a higher power. This is the story of Alvin York, the man who didn't believe in war, the conscientious objector who became America's most celebrated hero of World War I, the backwoods marksman who proved that sometimes the most reluctant warriors become the greatest soldiers. This is a story of how faith, marksmanship, and a stubborn refusal to quit turned an impossible situation into the most famous single-handed action in American military history. This is the story of Sergeant York. To understand what Alvin York did on October 8th, 1918, you must understand where he came from and what made him who he was. Alvin York was born on December 13th, 1887, in a 2-room log cabin near Pall Mall, Tennessee, a tiny community in the Appalachian Mountains in Fentress County. His parents, William Uriah York and Mary Elizabeth Brooks, were subsistence farmers, meaning they grew just enough food to survive and not much more. The York family was poor, even by the standards of rural Tennessee in the 1880s. Alvin was the third of 11 children. The family lived in that 2-room cabin with no electricity, no running water, and barely enough food. William York worked the farm, and occasionally found work as a blacksmith. Mary York raised the children, tended the garden, and kept the household running. It was a hard life, endless work for little reward, but it was the only life the Yorks knew. The Appalachian Mountains in the late 1800s were isolated, rugged, and unforgiving. Pall Mall was 40 miles from the nearest railroad. There were no paved roads. The nearest town of any size was Jamestown, 15 miles away over mountain trails. Most families in the area lived like the Yorks. Small farms, log cabins, growing corn and tobacco, raising hogs and chickens, hunting deer and turkey to supplement their diet. Education was scarce. Alvin attended a 1-room schoolhouse when he could, when there wasn't farm work that needed doing, but he only made it to the 3rd grade. He learned to read and write, barely, but books and formal learning weren't part of his world. What he learned from his father: how to plow a field, how to shoe a horse, how to work a blacksmith's forge, and most importantly, how to shoot. William York was an expert marksman, a skill essential for survival in the mountains. Hunting provided meat for the family. A good shot meant the difference between eating and going hungry. William taught Alvin to shoot when the boy was about 6 years old, starting with a muzzle-loading rifle that was almost as tall as Alvin. By the time he was 8, Alvin could hit a squirrel in the head at 50 yards. By the time he was 10, he could outshoot most men in Fentress County. Alvin's weapon of choice was a .45-70 Springfield rifle, a single-shot, breech-loading rifle that had been standard issue for the U.S. Army in the 1870s and 1880s. It fired a heavy .45 caliber bullet with tremendous stopping power, but required precision. You only got 1 shot before reloading, so you had to make it count. Alvin became a master of that weapon. He could load, aim, and fire in seconds. He could hit a moving target at 100 yards. He developed a technique where he'd fire, reload, and fire again so fast that it sounded like 2 shots from a repeating rifle. Hunting in the Appalachian Mountains required more than just good aim. It required patience, fieldcraft, and an understanding of animal behavior. Alvin hunted deer, but his specialty was wild turkey, one of the most challenging game animals in North America. Turkeys have excellent eyesight and hearing. They're nervous, alert, and quick to flee. Hunting them requires stealth, camouflage, and perfect shot placement. Alvin developed a specific technique for turkey hunting. When a flock took flight, most hunters would shoot the lead bird, but Alvin would shoot the bird at the back of the flock. Why? Because when the lead bird drops, the rest of the flock scatters immediately. But if you shoot the rear bird, the others don't notice right away, giving you time to reload and shoot again. Alvin could often bring down 3 or 4 turkeys from a single flock using this method. This skill, picking off targets from back to front so the others don't realize they're under attack, would save his life and the lives of his men on October 8, 1918. But Alvin York wasn't just a hunter and farmer. He was also, by his own later admission, a hellraiser. As a teenager and young man, Alvin drank heavily. Moonshine was the drink of choice in the Tennessee mountains, and he got into fights. A lot of fights. He had a temper, and when he drank, the temper got worse. He'd ride into Jamestown on weekends, drink at the saloons, play cards, and start brawls. He wasn't mean-spirited. Friends described him as good-natured when sober, but alcohol turned him into someone else. Alvin also gambled. Card games, dice, any bet he could make. He lost more than he won, which didn't help the family's already desperate finances. His mother prayed for him constantly, begging him to give up drinking and gambling and turn to God. Alvin would promise to change, then break the promise the next weekend. This pattern continued for years. Alvin worked a farm, hunted to feed the family, and drank away whatever money he made. He wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't building a future. He was just existing day to day in the mountains of Tennessee. Then came 1914. On a hot summer day in 1914, Alvin and several friends were drinking and playing cards at a local saloon. One of his closest friends, a young man named Everett Delk, got into an argument with another man. The argument escalated. The other man pulled a knife. In the scuffle that followed, Delk was stabbed. He died on the floor of the saloon while Alvin held him. The death of Everett Delk shook Alvin York to his core. It was a moment of clarity. This was where his life was headed. Violence, alcohol, pointless death. He was 26 years old and going nowhere. Around the same time, a traveling preacher came to Pall Mall and held a revival meeting. Alvin attended, more out of guilt and his mother's insistence than genuine interest. But something about the preacher's message resonated. The preacher talked about redemption, about how no one was too lost to be saved, about how God could transform even the worst sinner into a new creation. Alvin York went to the altar call. He got down on his knees in front of 100 people and prayed. He asked God to forgive him for the wasted years, the drinking, the fighting, the gambling. He pledged to change his life. And he did. Alvin joined the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a small fundamentalist Christian denomination common in rural Tennessee. The church's theology was strict. No drinking, no smoking, no dancing, no gambling. Members were expected to live according to literal interpretations of the Bible. Alvin threw himself into his new faith with the same intensity he'd once thrown into drinking and fighting. He quit alcohol completely. He stopped gambling. He started attending church multiple times a week. He studied the Bible. Despite his limited education, he could quote scripture extensively. He became known in the community as a devout, serious Christian, a complete transformation from the hellraiser he'd been just months before. But Alvin's newfound faith created a problem that would define the next several years of his life. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. Alvin York took that commandment literally. Killing was a sin. War was mass killing. Therefore, war was sinful, and Christians should not participate in it. This wasn't unusual in rural fundamentalist churches. Many denominations taught that Christians should be pacifists, that Jesus' command to turn the other cheek meant refusing violence even in self-defense. For 3 years, this theological position didn't matter. America wasn't at war. Alvin worked a farm, attended church, courted a local girl named Gracie Williams, and lived a quiet, faithful life. Then came April 6, 1917. The United States declared war on Germany and entered World War I. When America entered World War I in April 1917, the U.S. Army had about 127,000 active-duty soldiers. nowhere near enough to fight a modern war in Europe, where millions of men were already engaged in the trenches. The government passed the Selective Service Act, creating a draft. All men between the ages of 21 and 30 were required to register for possible military service. On June 5, 1917, Alvin York walked to the draft registration office in Jamestown, Tennessee, and filled out his registration card. On the line that asked, "Do you claim exemption from draft?" Alvin wrote, "Yes, don't want to fight." His reasoning was simple. His faith prohibited killing. The Bible said, "Thou shalt not kill." War required killing. Therefore, he couldn't participate in war without sinning. The problem was that "I don't want to fight" wasn't a valid legal exemption. The Selective Service Act allowed exemptions for certain categories: essential war workers, sole surviving sons, and members of recognized pacifist religious groups like Quakers or Mennonites. The Church of Christ and Christian Union wasn't on the list of recognized pacifist denominations. Alvin's exemption request was denied. In the fall of 1917, Alvin received his draft notice. He was to report to Camp Gordon in Georgia for basic training. He considered refusing, becoming a draft dodger, but that would mean prison, and prison would destroy his mother and his fiancée, Gracie. He considered fleeing to the mountains, living as a fugitive, but that wasn't who he was anymore. He'd pledged to live as a Christian, and Christians followed the law. So in November 1917, Alvin York reported to Camp Gordon, Georgia, still convinced that war was sinful, still believing he shouldn't be there, but willing to go because the law required it. Camp Gordon was a massive training facility outside Atlanta, Georgia, built specifically to train soldiers for World War I. Thousands of men from across the country were processed to the camp. Farm boys like Alvin, factory workers from cities, college students, immigrants who barely spoke English. They were formed into units, taught to march, shoot, throw grenades, fight with bayonets, dig trenches, and follow orders. Alvin was assigned to Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division. The 82nd Division was nicknamed the All-American Division because it drew soldiers from every state in the Union. Alvin's company commander was Captain Edward Danforth, a regular Army officer. His battalion commander was Major George Edward Buxton, a Yale-educated lawyer who had volunteered for service. Both officers noticed Alvin York immediately, not because he was a troublemaker, but because he was an exceptional soldier in every way except one. He still didn't think he should be fighting. On the rifle range, Alvin shot perfect scores. While other recruits struggled to hit targets at 200 yards, Alvin was consistently hitting bullseyes at 300 yards with iron sights. His marksmanship instructors had never seen anything like it. When asked where he'd learned to shoot like that, Alvin said simply, "Turkey hunting back home." In field exercises, Alvin demonstrated natural leadership. He was calm under pressure, made good tactical decisions, and other soldiers listened to him. He was promoted to corporal within weeks. But Captain Danforth noticed that Alvin never seemed happy. He followed orders, did his duty, but there was a sadness about him, a sense that he was violating something fundamental to who he was. One day, Danforth called Alvin into his office and asked him directly, "York, what's wrong?" Alvin explained his religious beliefs. Killing was a sin. War required killing. He didn't want to kill anyone. Danforth was a career Army officer, not particularly religious, but he respected Alvin's sincerity. He called in Major Buxton, who was more intellectually inclined and had studied theology at Yale. Over the next several weeks, Danforth and Buxton had multiple long conversations with Alvin about faith, duty, and war. They didn't try to change his religious beliefs. Instead, they engaged with him. They discussed Bible passages. They talked about the difference between murder and combat. They explored the concept of just war, the idea that some wars are morally necessary to stop evil. The key passage that swayed Alvin was Matthew 22, verse 21, where Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Buxton argued that this passage meant Christians have dual obligations, to God and to their country. Serving in the military wasn't about murder. It was about defending your nation and your fellow citizens from aggression. Alvin wrestled with this. He read the Bible extensively. He prayed. He wrote letters home to his pastor and to Gracie Williams, asking for their guidance. Finally, he came to a conclusion. He could serve God and serve his country. He could be a Christian and a soldier. If he was fighting to defend freedom and stop tyranny, he wasn't committing murder. He was fulfilling his duty to both God and Caesar. Years later, Alvin described a moment of clarity. "I want to be both a good Christian and a good American. I figured I could do both." Once Alvin made peace with his conscience, he threw himself into training with the same intensity he brought to everything else: hunting, drinking, faith. He became one of the best soldiers in the 82nd Division. In the spring of 1918, he was promoted to sergeant. In May 1918, the 82nd Division shipped out to France. The 82nd Division arrived in France in May 1918 and spent the summer training and acclimating to conditions on the Western Front. For American soldiers fresh from training camps in the United States, France was a shock. The Western Front in 1918 was hell on earth. For 4 years, the Germans and the Allies had been locked in trench warfare, static lines of fortifications stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Millions of men lived in trenches filled with mud, rats, lice, and the bodies of the dead. Artillery barges lasted days. Poison gas drifted across no man's land. Casualties were measured in tens of thousands for battles that gained a few hundred yards of ground. Alvin York's first exposure to combat came in June 1918, when the 82nd Division was sent to a quiet sector of the line for training under fire. Quiet was relative. There was still artillery fire, sniper fire, occasional raids, but it wasn't the massive offensives that were grinding up divisions elsewhere on the line. Alvin adapted quickly. His hunting experience made him a natural scout. He could move silently through no man's land, observe German positions without being seen, and return with accurate intelligence. His marksmanship made him invaluable during trench raids. He could pick off German sentry from distances that would have challenged most soldiers. In August 1918, the 82nd Division participated in its first major offensive, the Battle of St. Mihiel. The battle was an American-led operation to reduce a German salient, a bulge in the front lines, near the town of St. Mihiel. Over 550,000 American soldiers attacked, supported by French artillery and tanks. The Germans, already planning withdrawal, offered limited resistance. The salient was eliminated in 4 days with relatively light casualties. For Alvin York, St. Mihiel was his introduction to large-scale combat. The noise was overwhelming. Artillery barges that shook the ground, machine gun fire, explosions. The confusion was total. Units getting lost, orders changing, communication breaking down. But through it all, Alvin stayed calm, followed orders, kept his men alive. After St. Mihiel, the 82nd Division was pulled out of the line for rest and resupply. The respite was brief. The American command was planning the largest American military operation in history, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which began on September 26, 1918, was intended to break the German lines in northeastern France and push toward the industrial heartland of Germany. The offensive involved over 1.2 million American soldiers, the largest American army ever assembled up to that point in history. The terrain was nightmarish. The Argonne Forest was dense, ancient woodland that had been fortified by the Germans for 4 years. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Barbed wire entanglements stretched for miles. Artillery positions were pre-sighted to hit any avenue of advance. The Germans had turned the Argonne into a fortress. The 82nd Division was assigned to attack through the western edge of the Argonne Forest. The objective was to push north, eliminate German strongpoints, and break through to the Kriemhilde-Stellung, the main German defensive line. The offensive began on September 26 with a massive artillery barrage. At 5:30 hours, American infantry went over the top and advanced into the Argonne. Initial progress was good. The Germans were surprised by the scale of the attack. But within days, the offensive bogged down. The terrain was too difficult, the German defenses too strong. Casualties mounted. Entire battalions were chewed up by machine gun fire. By early October, the Meuse-Argonne offensive had stalled. American casualties were approaching 100,000. The Germans still held key defensive positions. The Argonne Forest was littered with dead and wounded from both sides. On October 7, 1918, the 328th Infantry Regiment, Alvin York's unit, was ordered to attack a German position on a ridgeline in the Argonne. The attack would jump off at dawn the next day, October 8, 1918. October 8, 1918, dawned cold and misty in the Argonne Forest. Sergeant Alvin York and his platoon had spent the night in a muddy trench, trying to sleep, failing, waiting for dawn and the attack order. The mission was straightforward in concept, impossible in execution. Advance north of forest, locate and neutralize German machine gun nests that were holding up the American advance, seize a ridgeline that commanded the surrounding area. At 6:10 hours, a patrol of 17 men from Company G moved out into the forest. The patrol was commanded by Sergeant Bernard Early. Alvin York was second in command. The other 15 men were a mix of experienced soldiers and recent replacements. They moved cautiously through the forest, using trees and undergrowth for cover. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no sounds except the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of sniper fire. About half an hour into the patrol, they stumbled upon a German trench system. The Germans were as surprised as the Americans. A brief firefight erupted. The Germans, part of a battalion command post, quickly surrendered. The Americans had captured about 25 prisoners, including several officers. Sergeant Early ordered the prisoners to be herded together. The plan was to take them back to American lines for interrogation, then continue the mission. But as they were organizing the prisoners, disaster struck. From a ridgeline above, German machine guns opened fire. The German machine guns, at least a dozen MG-08 as positioned on the ridge, had interlocking fields of fire covering the entire area. When they opened up simultaneously, the effect was catastrophic. MG-08 machine guns fired 450 to 600 rounds per minute. Each gun had a crew of 4 to 6 soldiers. The guns were belt-fed, water-cooled, and could fire continuously for extended periods. A single MG-08 could sweep an area the size of a football field in seconds. A dozen MG-08s created a killing zone where nothing could survive. In the first burst of fire, 6 Americans were killed instantly, shot multiple times before they even realized they were under attack. Sergeant Early was hit in the chest and went down mortally wounded. 3 other Americans were wounded, legs shattered, arms broken by bullets, screaming in pain. The survivors, Alvin York and 7 other unwounded Americans, dug for cover in a small depression at the base of the ridge. The German prisoners hit the ground too, terrified they'd be killed by their own side's fire. Alvin York found himself in command of 8 Americans, including himself, and 25 German prisoners, pinned down by at least a dozen machine guns, with no way to retreat, no way to advance, no support, and no communication with American lines. Above them, German soldiers were shouting to each other, reloading, preparing to finish off the Americans. Any movement would draw fire. They were trapped. Alvin assessed the situation in seconds. If they stayed where they were, they'd eventually be overrun or killed. If they tried to retreat, they'd be cut down in the open. The German prisoners were useless. They couldn't help even if they wanted to. But Alvin had one advantage. The ridge above was covered in brush and trees. The German machine gun crews could see the depression where the Americans were trapped, but they couldn't see Alvin clearly if he moved carefully. Alvin made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was going to attack. Alone, Alvin York crawled out of the depression, moving slowly through the underbrush, working his way toward the ridge. He was carrying his M1917 Enfield rifle, a bolt-action rifle chambered in .30-06 that was accurate to 600 yards in the hands of a skilled marksman. Alvin was better than skilled. He was one of the best rifle shots in the American Army. He found a position where he could see German soldiers on the ridge without being clearly visible himself. The soldiers were focused on a depression where the Americans were pinned down, not on the underbrush to their flank. Alvin raised his rifle, sighted on a German soldier manning a machine gun, and fired. The German dropped, shot through the head. Alvin worked the bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge, chambering a new round. He aimed at another German soldier. This one had turned, trying to locate the source of the shot. Alvin fired. The German fell. Bolt action. Eject. Chamber. Aim. Fire. 3rd German down. The machine gun crews were now confused. They were taking fire from somewhere, but couldn't see the shooter. They swung their guns around. Firing burst into the underbrush, but Alvin had already moved to a different position. 4th German. 5th. 6th. Alvin was using the turkey hunting technique he learned in the Tennessee mountains. Shoot the soldiers at the back of the group first, the ones furthest from the main cluster. That way, the soldiers up front don't immediately realize their comrades are dying. By the time they figure out where the shots are coming from, half their unit is dead. 7th German. 8th. 9th. The German machine gun crews were panicking now. They could see their comrades falling, but couldn't locate the shooter. Some tried to run. Alvin shot them as they fled. 10th. 11th. 12th. German officers were shouting orders, trying to organize a response. Alvin shot the officers. 13th, 14th, 15th. At some point during this engagement, Alvin later couldn't remember exactly when 6 German soldiers fixed bayonets and charged his position. They came screaming through the underbrush, bayonets leveled, trying to kill the American shooter, who was decimating their unit. Alvin dropped his rifle and drew his .45 caliber M1911 pistol. He had 7 rounds in the magazine, plus 1 in the chamber, 8 shots total. The Germans were coming straight at him, spread out in a line. Alvin did something counterintuitive. Instead of shooting the lead soldier, the closest threat, he shot the soldier at the back of the line. Why? The same reason he shot turkeys from back to front. If you shoot the lead soldier, the others see him fall and scatter. But if you shoot the rear soldier, the ones in front don't notice immediately. Alvin fired. The rear German fell. The others kept charging. Alvin fired again. Second German from the back dropped. The lead soldiers still hadn't noticed. Third shot. Fourth shot. Fifth shot. 5 Germans down. The lead soldier finally realized something was wrong and turned to look. Alvin shot him. 6th shot. Second soldier in line dropped. 7th shot. The last German fell just feet from Alvin's position. 8 shots. 6 dead Germans. Years later, in interviews, Alvin would express deep regret about this engagement. He had been willing to shoot Germans who were manning machine guns. That was combat. But killing men in hand-to-hand range, looking them in the eyes, felt different. It haunted him. By now, Alvin had been fighting for about 20 minutes. He had killed at least 20 Germans, probably more, though the chaos made accurate counting impossible. The German machine gun fire had slackened. Crews were abandoning their positions, fleeing deeper into the forest. Then something unexpected happened. A German officer stood up, waving a white handkerchief, shouting in broken English, "Stop! Stop! I surrender!" The officer was First Lieutenant Paul Jürgen Vollmer, commander of the German 2nd Battalion, 120th Württemberg Landwehr Regiment. Vollmer had been in the command post when the Americans initially captured it. He had watched from cover as Alvin York methodically killed his machine gun crews. He realized that if the fighting continued, his entire battalion would be annihilated, so he surrendered. Alvin kept his rifle pointed at Vollmer and said, "All right, tell your men to come down here with their hands up." Vollmer shouted orders in German. Slowly, cautiously, German soldiers began emerging from positions on the ridge. Machine gunners, riflemen, officers, runners. They walked down the slope with their hands raised, forming a growing crowd of prisoners. Alvin counted them, 90 prisoners, including Vollmer and several other officers. Combined with the 25 prisoners from the original command post, Alvin York now had 115 German prisoners, plus the 7 surviving Americans from his original patrol. And he was still deep in the Argonne Forest, behind German lines, with no communication and no support. Alvin needed to get back to American lines. He ordered Vollmer to organize the prisoners into a column. Vollmer complied. He spoke some English and didn't want more of his men killed. As the column began moving to the forest, they encountered more German soldiers. Small groups scattered through the forest. Stragglers from other units, men who had been separated from their commands. When these soldiers saw a column of over 100 German prisoners being marched by a handful of Americans, most surrendered immediately rather than fight. By the time Alvin York reached American lines at approximately 10:30 hours, he had 132 German prisoners. When the column emerged from the forest, American soldiers at the front line couldn't believe what they were seeing. One American corporal, Alvin, had started the patrol as a corporal. He'd be promoted to sergeant days later, at the head of a column of 132 German soldiers. A lieutenant asked Alvin, "How many prisoners have you got?" Alvin replied, "Honest lieutenant, I don't know. I ain't had time to count 'em yet, but I reckon they's a considerable bunch." The prisoners were processed. The count was verified. 132 Germans, including 4 officers and 128 enlisted men. Intelligence officers interrogated Vollmer, who explained what had happened. He said he'd surrender because the American corporal was killing so many of my men, I thought it best to surrender. When asked how many Germans Alvin had killed, Vollmer estimated at least 25, possibly more. Later investigation confirmed at least 20 confirmed kills, though the number might be higher due to the chaos and difficulty identifying all bodies in the forest. Alvin's company commander, Captain Danforth, asked him, "York, how did you do this?" Alvin's answer was simple. "Captain, it's not manpower. It's supernatural power that done it. I had a higher power." News of Alvin York's single-handed action spread through the American Expeditionary Force within days. Brigadier General Julian Lindsay, commander of the 82nd Division, personally visited Alvin to hear the story firsthand. Lindsay submitted paperwork recommending Alvin for the Medal of Honor. The story reached American newspapers by late October. Here was a narrative that Americans could understand and celebrate. A humble backwoods Christian who didn't want to fight became a soldier out of duty and then performed the most incredible individual feat of arms in American history. The press loved it. Alvin York became famous before he even left France. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. The war ended. Alvin York had been in combat for less than 6 months. He had survived. Before returning to the United States, Alvin received recognition from France. On November 22, 1918, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, Supreme Allied Commander and the man who had coordinated the final Allied offensives, personally decorated Alvin York with the Croix de Guerre with Palm, France's highest military honor for valor. During the ceremony, Foch reportedly said, "Alvin, what you did was the greatest thing accomplished by any soldier of all the armies of Europe." Alvin didn't know how to respond. He mumbled something about just doing his duty. The Italian government awarded him the Croce al Merito di Guerra. The government of Montenegro, which had been occupied by Austro-Hungarian forces during the war, awarded him the Montenegrin Medal of Bravery. And on April 18, 1919, the United States government awarded Sergeant Alvin C. York the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. The citation read, "After his platoon had suffered heavy casualties and 3 other non-commissioned officers had become casualties, Corporal York assumed command. Fearlessly leading 7 men, he charged with great daring a machine gun nest which was pouring deadly and incessant fire upon his platoon. In this heroic feat, the machine gun nest was taken, together with 4 officers and 128 men and several guns." The citation was slightly inaccurate. The initial platoon strength was 17. Not all casualties occurred before York took command, and the final prisoner count was 132, but the essential facts were correct. Alvin York returned to the United States in May 1919. He was given a hero's welcome that few soldiers in American history have experienced. On May 22, 1919, New York City gave Alvin a ticker tape parade down Broadway. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets. Confetti rained down from buildings. Alvin rode in an open car, waving awkwardly to the crowds. He later said it was more terrifying than combat. He was a backwoods farmer from Tennessee, and here were millions of city people treating him like royalty. Politicians wanted to meet him. President Woodrow Wilson received him at the White House. Congress held a reception in his honor. Governors of multiple states invited him for official visits. And then came the offers. Hollywood producers wanted to make a movie about his life. They offered Alvin substantial sums, figures in the tens of thousands of dollars, enormous money in 1919. Vaudeville promoters wanted him to tour the country, telling his story on stage for paying audiences. Publishing companies wanted him to write a book. Advertising firms wanted him to endorse products, cigarettes, rifles, alcohol. Alvin York turned down almost everything. His explanation was consistent. This uniform ain't for sale. He believed that profiting from his military service would dishonor the men who had died. The 17 men in his patrol, the 6 who were killed on October 8th, they couldn't profit from their service because they were dead. So Alvin felt he shouldn't profit either. He gave speeches, but usually for free or for small honorariums that went charity. He did a few endorsements, but only for products he actually used and believed in. He turned down the Hollywood offers because he didn't want actors pretending to be his dead comrades. What Alvin York wanted more than fame or money was to go home to Tennessee and marry Gracie Williams. On June 7, 1919, Alvin married Gracie Williams in Pall Mall, Tennessee. The wedding was a major media event. Reporters came from across the country to cover it. But the ceremony itself was simple, held at the Church of Christ in Christian Union, where Alvin had found faith 5 years earlier. The people of Tennessee wanted to honor their war hero. The Tennessee state legislature organized a fundraising campaign to buy Alvin a farm. Donations poured in, small amounts from working-class Tennesseans, larger amounts from wealthy citizens. Within months, they had raised enough money to buy a 385-acre farm near Pall Mall, complete with a house, barn, and livestock. The house wasn't a mansion. It was a modest 2-story frame house, but compared to the 2-room log cabin Alvin had grown up in, it was palatial. Alvin and Gracie moved into the farm and began building a life. They would eventually have 8 children. Alvin farmed, hunted, and tried to live a quiet life. But the fame wouldn't leave him alone. One cause became central to Alvin's post-war life: education. Alvin had only completed 3rd grade. He could read, but not well. His writing was basic. His math was functional but limited. He had educated himself through life experience, the Bible, and necessity, but he was acutely aware of what he'd missed. The children of rural Tennessee in the 1920s faced the same educational barriers Alvin had faced. Poor schools, lack of teachers, families that needed children working on farms instead of sitting in classrooms. Alvin wanted to change that. In 1926, Alvin founded the Alvin C. York Agricultural Institute, a school designed to provide education to rural mountain children who otherwise would have none. The school was located near Pall Mall and offered both academic subjects and practical agricultural training. Alvin raised funds for school, donated land, and personally supervised its operation. The school struggled financially. It was always one bad year away from closing, but Alvin kept it running through force of will, personal fundraising, and occasional help from Tennessee state government. The York Institute would educate thousands of rural Tennessee children over the next several decades and still operates today as a public high school. The Great Depression hit rural Tennessee hard. Alvin's farm, like most farms in the area, barely produced enough to feed his growing family. The York Institute struggled to stay open. Alvin took out loans to keep the school running, mortgaging his farm as collateral. By the late 1930s, Alvin was deeply in debt. The farm that Tennessee had given him was at risk of foreclosure. The school was on the verge of closing. Alvin had sacrificed his financial security for the cause of education, and it was destroying him. Then Hollywood came calling again. In 1940, film producer Jesse L. Lasky approached Alvin with a proposal, a major motion picture about his life and his actions on October 8, 1918. Warner Brothers would produce it. A-list actors would star. It would be a big-budget prestige picture. For 20 years, Alvin had refused such offers. But now, with his farm at risk and the York Institute on the verge of closing, he reconsidered. Lasky sweetened the deal, a substantial payment for the film rights, plus a percentage of profits. More importantly, Lasky agreed that the film would be respectful, accurate, and honor the men who had served with Alvin. Alvin agreed with conditions. Gary Cooper must play him. Alvin admired Cooper as an actor and felt he would portray him honorably. The film must be historically accurate. The film must honor the men who died and kissing scenes. Alvin's wife Gracie insisted on this. She didn't want another woman kissing her husband, even in a movie. Lasky agreed to all conditions. Sergeant York was released on July 2nd, 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor. Gary Cooper starred as Alvin York, with Joan Leslie as Gracie Williams, called Gracie in the film as well. The film was directed by Howard Hawks, one of Hollywood's top directors. Alvin traveled to Hollywood during production to ensure accuracy. He insisted that the battle scenes show the reality of combat, the confusion, the terror, the moral weight of killing. Gary Cooper spent time with Alvin, learning his speech patterns, his mannerisms, the way he moved. Cooper later said it was the most important role of his career. The film was a massive success. It was the highest-grossing film of 1941. Gary Cooper won the Academy Award for Best Actor. The film was nominated for Best Picture, losing to How Green Was My Valley. More importantly for Alvin, the film royalties paid off his debts. The farm was saved. The York Institute was secure. Alvin could breathe again. And then, 6 months after the film's release, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II on December 8, 1941. Alvin York, now 54 years old and in poor health, was too old for military service. But he threw himself into the war effort in other ways. He traveled the country giving speeches at war bond rallies, encouraging young men to enlist, supporting military recruitment. He visited training camps, talking to soldiers, telling them about the importance of marksmanship, discipline, and faith. The irony wasn't lost on Alvin. The man who had been a conscientious objector in 1917 was now encouraging young men to fight in 1942. But Alvin's theology had evolved. He had come to believe that some wars were necessary, that evil had to be resisted, that defending freedom sometimes required violence. World War II, in his view, was such a war. His health declined throughout the 1940s and 1950s. He suffered from a variety of ailments, arthritis, respiratory problems, complications from old war injuries. He had a stroke in 1954 that left him partially paralyzed. Medical bills piled up again. Once more, the farm was at risk. This time, the state of Tennessee intervened. In 1956, the Tennessee legislature voted to grant Alvin a special pension and pay his medical bills. Grateful communities raised funds to cover his expenses. Alvin lived his final years in relative comfort, surrounded by family, still tending his farm as much as his health allowed. Alvin York died on September 2nd, 1964, at the age of 76. The cause was a cerebral hemorrhage. He died at the VA hospital in Nashville, Tennessee, with Gracie at his bedside. His funeral was held at the Wolf River Methodist Church near Pall Mall. Thousands attended: veterans, politicians, ordinary citizens from across Tennessee and beyond. He was buried in the Wolf River Cemetery, his grave marked by a simple headstone: Alvin C. York, Sergeant, World War I, Medal of Honor, 1887 to 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson issued statement: Sergeant Alvin C. York epitomized the gallantry of American fighting men and their sacrifices in behalf of freedom. The story of Alvin York raises profound questions about faith, duty, courage, and what it means to be a hero. On Faith and War, Alvin York's journey from conscientious objector to warrior to hero is one of the most complex faith narratives in American military history. He didn't abandon his beliefs. He reconciled them with his duty. He found a way to serve God and serve his country, to maintain his Christian faith while engaging in combat. His answer wasn't perfect, and it troubled him for the rest of his life. He never glorified war. He never celebrated killing. But he believed he had done what was necessary, what was right. His struggle represents the struggle millions of religious people face when their faith's teachings about peace conflict with their nation's call to arms. On Reluctant Heroes, the best warriors are often reluctant warriors. Alvin didn't want to fight. He had to be convinced, persuaded, argued into accepting that combat could be morally justified. But once convinced, he fought with extraordinary courage and skill, precisely because he understood the moral weight of what he was doing. He wasn't killing for glory or advancement. He was fighting because he believed it was necessary to protect his comrades and end the war. That moral clarity gave him strength that glory-seeking soldiers often lack. On skill and preparation, what Alvin York accomplished on October 8, 1918 wasn't luck. It was a result of decades of skill development. From age 6, he had been shooting rifles, hunting game, developing marksmanship to a degree few soldiers ever achieve. His turkey hunting technique, shooting from back to front to avoid alerting the flock, translated directly to combat tactics. His calmness under pressure, his patience, his understanding of how to move unseen through forest, all skills learned in the Tennessee mountains. When the moment came, he was prepared. Extraordinary performance looks like luck to those who don't understand the years of preparation behind it. On humility. Despite becoming one of the most famous soldiers in American history, Alvin York never sought glory. He attributed his survival and success to God, not to his own abilities. He refused to profit from his fame. He lived modestly, farmed his land, raised his children, and devoted his resources to educating rural children. When asked about October 8, 1918, he would say, "I'm proud of what I'd done, but I'm not proud that I had to do it." That distinction, pride in performance but regret at necessity, marked him as a man of genuine character. On the cost of heroism, Alvin York paid a price for his heroism that money couldn't measure. He suffered from what we would now call PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, guilt about the men he'd killed. The 6 Germans he'd shot at close range with his pistol haunted him. He could still see their faces decades later. Fame was a burden, not a blessing. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized, asked to tell a story, reminded of the worst day of his life. His health broke under the stress of war, poverty, and the weight of being a symbol. He died relatively young, worn out by the life he'd lived. On education as legacy, perhaps Alvin's greatest legacy isn't what he did on October 8, 1918, but what he did afterward. The Alvin C. York Agricultural Institute educated thousands of children who otherwise would have had no education. Those children went on to have careers, families, lives that wouldn't have been possible without Alvin's school. The ripple effects are incalculable. Doctors, teachers, engineers, parents, all because Alvin York believed education could break the cycle of poverty in the Tennessee mountains. The final assessment of Alvin York. On October 8, 1918, one man with one rifle accomplished what entire companies of soldiers couldn't. He neutralized a heavily defended German position, captured 132 prisoners, and created an opening that helped the American advance continue. The numbers are staggering. 28 confirmed kills, possibly more. 132 prisoners captured. 7 American lives saved, the survivors of the patrol, all accomplished in approximately 90 minutes by a 30-year-old former conscientious objector from rural Tennessee. But Alvin York's real achievement wasn't the numbers. It was proving that faith and duty can coexist, that reluctant warriors can be the bravest soldiers, that humility and heroism aren't contradictory, that one person acting with courage and skill can change the course of events. Marshal Foch was right. What Alvin York did was the greatest thing accomplished by any soldier in World War I. Not because the numbers were highest, other actions had higher body counts, but because the moral complexity, the skill, the courage, and humility all combined into something transcendent. Alvin York didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to go home, marry Gracie, farm his land, raise his children, and serve God. But when duty called, when his comrades needed him, when the moment demanded everything he had, he gave it. And then he went home, married Gracie, farmed his land, raised his children, served God, and spent the rest of his life trying to give back to the community that had shaped him. October 8th, 1918. Argonne Forest, France. A 30-year-old sergeant from Tennessee, armed with a rifle and a faith that would not break, stands alone against impossible odds. Behind him, 7 Americans and 25 German prisoners, pinned down, waiting to die. Above him, German machine guns that have already killed 6 of his comrades, ready to finish the rest. Ahead of him, a choice: retreat and abandon his men, or attack alone against 30 enemy soldiers. He attacks. For 90 minutes, Alvin York fights a one-man battle that would become legend. 28 Germans killed, 132 prisoners captured, 7 American lives saved. When asked how he did it, his answer is simple: I had a higher power. That is a legacy of Alvin York. The man who didn't want to fight became the soldier who couldn't be stopped. The conscientious objector who became America's greatest warrior. The backwoods hunter who became a national hero. The humble Christian who proved that faith, courage, and duty can coexist even in war's darkest hours. He didn't fight for glory. He fought for his comrades. He didn't seek fame. He sought to serve. He didn't celebrate killing. He mourned its necessity. Alvin York, 1887 to 1964. Sergeant, 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division, Medal of Honor, most decorated American soldier of World War I. The reluctant warrior who proved that sometimes the men who least want to fight make the greatest soldiers. Rest in peace, Sergeant York. Mission accomplished. All 132 captured. All 7 saved. Duty fulfilled.